Human life is reduced to real suffering. To hell, only when two ages, two cultures, and religions overlap. It goes on, it loses all power to understand itself and has no standard, no security, no simple acquiescence. That's Hermann Hesse from Steppenwolf. Really hits that feeling, doesn't it?
It really does. That sense of being adrift, caught between worlds. It's a feeling that probably resonates whenever society goes through these huge, rapid changes.
Right, that disorientation, losing your bearings when everything solid seems to be shifting.
Exactly. And that's kind of where we're going today in this deep dive for you, the learner. We're unpacking ideas from a pretty remarkable book, Zbigniew Brzezinski's Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technetronic Era, came out way back in 1970.
1970, wow. And it still feels relevant.
Oh, absolutely. Surprisingly so. Brzezinski offered this really sharp perspective on transformations that are still shaping things today. He zeroed in on this central paradox.
Okay, a paradox. Let's get into that. What was the main idea, the tension he saw?
Well, he argued that humanity was becoming more unified and more fragmented all at the same time. Technology was shrinking the world, right? Faster communication, travel, forging connections.
Bring people closer in a way.
But at the same time, those very forces were eroding, old loyalties, traditional structures, established ways of thinking.
So pulled together and pushed apart simultaneously.
Yeah.
It really does sound like he was anticipating the internet age, even back then.
In many ways, yes. And that's our mission today, really, to dig into this idea of the technotronic revolution he described. We want to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and just get a better handle on the implications of this massive shift he saw coming.
Technetronic revolution.
Yeah.
It does sound very 70s sci-fi. So what did he actually mean by technetronic? What made it different from the industrial society that came before? More than just computers and electronics, I assume.
Oh, much more. He saw it as a deep, fundamental shift, not just new gadgets, but a whole restructuring of, well, everything. Society, the economy, how people lived, how they related to each other.
Okay, so let's break that down. What were some of the big differences he flagged between industrial and technotronic society? Maybe start with the role of women.
Yeah, that's a fascinating angle. He pointed out how in the industrial era, machines started making pure physical strength less critical for many jobs.
Right, especially compared to, say, agrarian life.
Exactly. And that shift, he argued, weakened some traditional arguments against women's rights and sort of fueled the demands for political equality.
That makes sense. If the work changes, the old justifications start to crumble. So how did the Technetronic era build on that or change it?
Well, automation started impacting manual jobs for everyone, men and women. But what became more valuable were, intellectual skills, information processing,
Right.
skills less tied to gender.
Okay.
And crucially, he points to the birth control pill. That was a game changer for sexual equality, giving women unprecedented control over reproduction, which opened up educational and career paths. This, plus changing attitudes, really pushed the drive for complete equality forward.
Right, the pill had massive ripple effects. Okay, what about another area? How people organized politically. The masses, as they used to say. How did that change from the industrial age?
Industrial society saw the rise of these big organized groups, didn't it? Powerful trade unions, mass political parties, often built around strong ideologies. And communication was mainly through things like newspapers, very much tied to national language and fostering national identity.
So mass movements, but kind of contained within national borders, often fueled by nationalism. How did the technotronic shift disrupt that pattern?
The trend Brzezinski saw was towards politicians aggregating support differently, reaching millions of individual citizens directly, mostly through new mass media like television.
TV. The big new thing back then.
Right. And TV is different from print, isn't it? It's about images. Images can cross language barriers much more easily than text. Think about seeing images of a war or maybe hunger in India on the news.
Yeah, you get an immediate emotional hit, even if you don't know the full context.
Exactly. So potentially a more global perspective, maybe more cosmopolitan. But he also hinted it could be more superficial, more emotional reaction, less reasoned analysis based on reading.
That sounds familiar. The potential for manipulation, maybe? Appealing directly to emotion over logic?
He definitely saw that potential. This more impressionistic view of the world, driven by images, could create a kind of surface connection, but maybe lack the depth you'd get from, engaging with complex arguments in print within your national context.
That's a really thought-provoking point for today. Okay, what about goals? What people strived for? Did the idea of Social attainment, like what success looks like, changed too.
He thought so. In the industrial era, success was often measured by, well, stuff. Acquiring goods, building wealth. Very tangible.
Keeping up with the Joneses, basically.
Pretty much. But in the Technetronic society, he saw a shift, especially among the young. A growing potential, maybe even a moral push to use science and technology not just to get more things, but to improve the actual quality of life, to pursue more humane goals.
So moving beyond just material wealth towards well-being enabled by tech sounds pretty good, actually.
It's a hopeful potential, for sure. But it was also clear this technotronic revolution was happening globally, but real, genuine unity was still a long way off. He used an interesting comparison with how cities grow.
Cities. How does that relate?
Well, think about a huge metropolis. It brings lots of people together, but does it unify them into one single mind? Not really. People have multiple loyalties, their job, their neighborhood, their ethnicity, politics.
Right. It gets complicated. Lots of different groups, sometimes conflicting interests.
Exactly. He described big city politics, especially in America, as inherently messy. Lots of jostling between interest groups, temporary alliances, localized squabbles. He saw that same kind of messy interaction playing out globally.
So not one big happy family, but more like a complex, sometimes tense network of interactions.
That was his prediction for the near future anyway. Limited conflicts, compromises, ongoing negotiation, rather than some kind of deep, unified world order. Certainly makes you think about how things look now, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so this paradox. Unifying forces, fragmenting forces. Let's dig into the fragmentation side a bit more. What were the older forces that used to keep things more contained within nations?
Historically, thinking back before this era, some transnational things had faded, like the old European aristocracy, with all their cross-border family ties and influence. That weakened.
Okay, the old ruling class lost its international glue.
And even things that started international, like the church, or ideologies like socialism and communism, they tended to become quite nationalized over time. Their main focus, their power base, became the nation-state itself.
So the nation-state really solidified as the main political box. What started breaking that box down in the Technetronic era? What were the big drivers of unification he saw?
Well, technology was key, obviously. Faster communication, easier travel. It just made countries much more interdependent, relying on each other economically and practically.
You couldn't just ignore the rest of the world anymore?
Right. And then you had the rise of truly global problems. Things like environmental threats, pandemics maybe, that no single nation could solve alone. That forced cooperation.
And international organizations popped up to deal with that.
Exactly. He mentions loads of them, the WHO for health, the FAO for food, the World Bank, all trying to tackle these shared challenges on a global scale. There was also this growing idea of functional planning, trying to coordinate things like development aid internationally.
Like the UN development goals we talk about now.
Sort of the precursor, yeah. And beyond the practical stuff, there were shared human things too, concerns about health, nutrition, even shared spectacles like the Olympics or the space race, things that made people feel part of a single humanity, at least sometimes.
Okay, so lots pulling towards cooperation. But the fragmentation didn't just disappear, right? What kept pushing countries and people apart?
Oh, absolutely. A huge factor was the gap in material conditions. Even if media made you feel closer, seeing how much richer other societies were, especially the gap that really widened with the Industrial Revolution, could breed resentment, not unity.
Yeah, seeing vast inequality beamed into your home probably doesn't foster global brotherhood.
Not necessarily. And then there's nationalism. It was surging, especially in newly independent countries throwing off colonialism. Nationalism could be a positive mobilizing force, sure, but it often turned nasty ethnic exclusion conflict.
Us versus them.
Pretty much. And he flagged a really worrying trend, the potential for the old East-West communist-capitalist conflict to morph into a North-South conflict, rich nations versus poor nations. An Algerian delegate at the UN apparently voiced this concern.
That North-South divide is definitely still a major fault line today. Wow. You mentioned a subjective transformation earlier, driven by media and education. Can you unpack that a bit?
He meant the change in people's awareness, how they saw the world, and it was happening fast. He gives this striking statistic. Radios in India quadrupled between 1958 and 1966. Just 8 years.
Quadrupled, that's huge.
It is. And he predicted transistors and TV would soon be everywhere in the developing world. This flood of information, plus more access to basic education, he references Samuel Huntington's work linking primary school enrollment to, well, instability.
More education leads to instability. How?
Huntington's idea, which Brzezinski notes, was that education raises expectations. If reality doesn't meet those new expectations, if you're still poor, still lack opportunity, it can breed frustration, unrest, even revolution.
Ah, I see. Awareness of inequality grows, aspirations grow, but the system doesn't deliver.
Exactly. And Brzezinski points to huge income disparities within countries like India using Gunnar Myrdal's data. The average income might look okay, but it hides desperate poverty for millions. He even talks about using satellite TV for education in India farming techniques, birth control, showing how tech could be a double-edged sword.
So much potential, but also so much risk if the underlying problems aren't fixed. Okay, let's talk ideologies. How did all this change impact big belief systems like Marxism? Was its influence fading by 1970?
Brzezinski argued yes, its universal appeal was diminishing. It wasn't dead by any means, but the world was more complex. Marxism wasn't the only game in town anymore, ideologically speaking.
It wasn't operating in a vacuum.
Right. It still had power, though. He mentions its ability to provide leaders in the developing world by tapping into anti-colonial feelings, sometimes using what he called reverse racism, mobilizing people based on past racial grievances.
But were Communist Party themselves changing?
He observed that in many developing countries, established Communist Party members were starting to adopt, Western lifestyles and comforts, which kind of undercut their revolutionary image among the poorest people they claimed to represent.
The revolutionaries getting comfortable. What about the big communist states, the Soviet Union, for instance? How was its model holding up?
Brzezinski was pretty critical here. He argued the Soviet system, which had industrialized Russia rapidly, had become rigid, stuck. It was actually hindering further progress, both technologically and socially.
How so?
Its social structure had become sort of industrial bourgeois, he suggests. And the politics were still dogmatic, authoritarian, there weren't exciting new goals, and the ideology itself felt bureaucratized, handled by committees, not inspiring movements.
The revolutionary fire had gone out, replaced by paperwork.
That's a good way to put it. And this caused problems. Communist parties in Western Europe started distancing themselves from the Soviet model to try and gain popular support. Even inside the USSR, there was a tendency to gloss over the bad parts, like Stalin's crimes, to maintain this image of perfect, inevitable progress.
An overly rosy picture that didn't match the messy reality of the changes happening.
Exactly. The official line seemed unprepared for the complexities of the scientific revolution, offering this simplistic view of a uniformly blissful communist future that just didn't ring true anymore.
Sounds like a system struggling to keep up. And then there was China. How did Mao's China fit in?
China threw a wrench in the works. It wasn't just following Moscow, it was challenging Moscow, claiming it represented the true path of communism. And China backed this up with its own development model and, crucially, its open support for revolutions elsewhere.
So, a major split. The communist world wasn't monolithic anymore.
Not at all. The Sino-Soviet split fractured the movement, creating rival centers competing for influence and ideological purity. A much messier picture.
Okay, let's shift focus to the U.S. How did Brzezinski see American society handling this transition into the Technetronic age?
He saw the U.S. as this unique blend. You had the individualistic frontier spirit layered with European traditions, plus a strong strand of concern for social welfare, partly thanks to early universal suffrage. He also noted the Civil War was important. It really dismantled the old aristocratic influence more thoroughly than in Europe.
So a society maybe more fluid, less hierarchical to begin with. How did technology then reshape things further?
He drew on Daniel Bell's work here. Technology was doing several things. Obviously raising living standards for many, shifting the focus from just how much stuff people had to the quality of their lives, changing work itself, creating new social groups, new jobs, new ways to move up the ladder.
Like the rise of tech workers, knowledge workers.
Precisely. And changing the whole relationship between, say, intellectual work and manual labor. Really fundamental shifts.
But transitions like that are never smooth. What were the big stresses and strains he saw emerging in the U.S.?
A major one was the struggle for Black Americans. The legacy of slavery and discrimination made it incredibly hard to integrate fully, especially as the economy shifted towards needing more complex social and technical skills.
Right, historical disadvantage colliding with new economic demands.
Exactly. So even though overall poverty might decrease, he predicted persistent poverty and, worryingly, potentially increasing racial tensions, despite efforts like university integration. It's quite sobering how relevant those concerns still feel.
Distressingly so. What other tensions did he highlight?
He saw friction between the old establishment elites and the new money and power coming from science, defense, the tech sector. He also pointed to massive problems in the big cities, explosive growth that the old government structures just weren't designed to handle.
Yeah, cities struggling with resources, infrastructure, governance.
And he noticed the restlessness among middle-class students, drawing parallels to Latin America, actually. Though he also felt the ideology of the student New Left at the time was a bit immature and maybe disconnected from historical realities.
So a lot of turmoil, a lot of questioning. Did he think the U.S. was genuinely at risk of falling apart? Revolution, even.
He acknowledged the possibility. If you had a perfect storm, economic collapse, race riots, urban chaos, youth alienation, deep divisions over foreign policy, yeah, national unity could fray.
But did he think it was likely?
No, ultimately he thought a serious revolution from the far left or a coup from the far right was improbable. Neither side seemed organized enough or had the mass support. Plus, he suspected such attempts might actually backfire and strengthen conservative forces.
Okay, so challenges, yes, but the system was likely resilient enough. How did he think the U.S. should adapt to navigate this technotronic era successfully?
Institutionally, he stressed adapting government, especially strengthening local and city governments, giving them more power and money to deal with urban problems directly.
Makes sense. Empower the level closest to the problems.
And he saw a huge role for education and the mass media in shaping a national culture that could handle this new complexity. He also had this idea of rational humanism.
Rational humanism, what do you mean by that?
Basically, the idea that with America's wealth and technology, it was becoming possible to really connect liberty with equality, to use reason and technology deliberately to reduce inequality and improve human well-being, moving beyond just materialism.
Applying tech towards ethical and social goals.
Yes, though he knew it would be a process, not an overnight fix. He did acknowledge risks, too, like applying tech without thinking through the social consequences or widening the gap between tech haves and have-nots.
A vision for progress, but needing careful, conscious effort. Okay, let's look outward again, internationally. He warned against seeing everything through a Western lens, right?
Yeah, very strongly. He argued you just couldn't understand global dynamics anymore by only using the historical playbook of a few Western nations. The world was too diverse, too complex.
So what did he see as the biggest hurdles to global cooperation in this new era?
Well, the economic gaps were huge. Poorer countries often couldn't absorb or benefit from advances in education or science the way richer ones could. National sovereignty was another barrier. Countries clung to it, even as they became more interdependent.
The old ways resisting the new realities.
Plus, you still had deep historical rivalries, ideological clashes. And he even suggested the internal politics of the Soviet Union, their leaders' own insecurities, would limit how much real cooperation was possible from their side.
A tangled web of obstacles. What about regional patterns? Do you predict anything specific?
He speculated that long-term countries within the Soviet or Chinese spheres might actually develop prevailing anti-Soviet or anti-Chinese feelings, regardless of what Moscow or Beijing did. He also floated the idea that we'd eventually need new ways for countries to relate, maybe moving beyond the absolute nation-state model. Perhaps looser associations, limiting sovereignty in some areas.
Wow, moving beyond the nation state, that's a big idea. What role did he see for the U.S. in all this?
A huge one. He felt the U.S. had a massive responsibility, maybe even an unavoidable one, in shaping whatever new global framework emerged. He knew that wasn't a popular view everywhere, but he tied it directly to America's lead in science and technology.
The idea being that America's tech edge gave it both influence and a kind of obligation.
And that other nations would inevitably need to adopt or adapt those advanced techniques themselves to keep up. He really stressed that tackling global crises required the developed nations, especially, to cooperate more and get past old ideological hang-ups. He saw signs of this maybe happening in Europe, growing support for integration in science, foreign policy. He mentions a French poll.
So cooperation among the advanced nations was key. Did he single out any other key players?
He touched on Japan, its unique position, balancing tradition and modernity, but also the potential risks there, like revived nationalism or radicalism. But the main thrust was this need for a community of developed nations to work together on shared problems.
A call for the technologically advanced world to get its act together, basically. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive into Brzezinski's Between Two Ages, what's the absolute core takeaway for us today, for you, the learner?
I think it has to be that central paradox he identified, this constant push and pull between unification, driven largely by technology, and fragmentation, driven by everything from economics to identity politics. It's just incredibly relevant.
Yeah, that tension feels like the defining feature of our time still.
Absolutely. Tech keeps changing everything, challenging old ways of thinking, creating amazing opportunities, but also massive global problems. We're more connected than ever, yet divisions seem as deep, maybe deeper than ever.
It really does feel like we're still very much living between two ages. So for you, the learner, maybe a final question to chew on.
Mm.
Thinking about this ongoing storm of change Brzezinski described, what areas seem most critical right now? Where do we most need individual action? And where do we absolutely need global cooperation to navigate this period successfully? And maybe think about your own life. How do you balance that feeling of national identity with the reality of being part of this deeply interconnected, often turbulent world? How do we find a path towards a future that's both stable and hopefully a bit more equitable?